season.
Duck season.
Wabbit season.
Duck season.
Wabbit season.
Duck season.
Hello and welcome to another Looney Tunes review video. If you are new to the channel, make sure you subscribe to follow my journey to review all 1000 classic Looney Tunes shorts and give this video a like as well. So this is a review for Rapid Fire, and with me today is one of many special guests is my good friend, Manny Cruz.
Shh. Be very quiet. I'm recording a review.
Remember, it's Manny season. Beginning of the video, you saw it's Anthony season. It's also Manny season. Dun, 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 dun.
Da-dun.
This is a very special video, massive milestone in terms of Looney Tunes, so we're going to have a whole bunch of special guests. The main conversation will be with myself and Manny, of course, lucky you. And later on, I'll be including clips from some previous collaborators on the channel, including one very special guest who will be showing up towards the end. You definitely want to stick around for that, but let's get underway. So as mentioned, this is for Rapid Fire, released on the 19th of May 1951. It had a blue ribbon reissue sometime in 1961. It's the 621st in the series and it's directed by, well, who else? Chuck Jones. This is lost media. No one's seen this until recently. It's a very obscure cartoon. Of course, I'm kidding. You can find this on the Looney Tunes Gold Collection Volume 1, Platinum Collection Volume 2, Bugs Bunny 80th, all sorts of streaming in terms of iTunes and all that stuff. It's all on there. I'll still mention what actually happens here in case you are one of the few people who haven't seen this one for whatever reason. But yes, a simple premise. Elmer is out hunting. Daffy's out to convince him that it's actually rabbit season and not duck season as what it actually is. And this leads to some of the greatest wordplay and visual gags in any short ever made. Period. A few bits of trivia before we really get underway here. Rapid Fire is a play on Rapid Fire.
I have been watching this cartoon for God knows how long. It wasn't until a few days ago when I was preparing for this commentary and I'm like, Rapid Fire. I don't get the pun, like rapid fire. And it's just a light bulb turned on in my head. I'm like, it took me 35 years to figure out that pun. Like, what's wrong with you, dude? It was right there. Rapid fire. And talk about being, slow to pick up on things. Extremely slow.
Well, better late than never, I suppose, and I guess that's a Ghostbusters 2 reference right there.
Ah, very
nice.
nice.
Very nice. Yes, Mr. Ghostbusters fan, you. This actually has quite a few firsts. So first of all, it's kind of weird when you think about it, and I'll explain why in a sec, but it's actually the first short that has Bugs Bunny and Daffy Duck actually starring together in a short. Yes, I am aware that Bugs Bunny does make a cameo at the end of Porky Pig's Feet, which has Porky and Daffy. I am aware of that, but this is the first time you have the two characters just starring together, not in a cameo or anything like that. And it's also the first time we hear Daffy say,
You're despicable.
Or despicable.
You would think he would have said that earlier, but no, that's where it starts. And it's also the first of the unofficially named Hunter trilogy, which has that simple premise of, Elmer out hunting and you have Bugs and Daffy and so on. So you got three major firsts there. This is not quite a first because I sort of have a bit of an argument to make here, but some have considered this to be the first short where Daffy has like a complete personality change and becomes a more greedy duck versus a screwball character from before. But I would argue that greediness was starting to become a premise before this short. You sort of had kind of like a hybrid of Daffy.
If you really want to trace it back to its origin, you can go back as early as 1940. Because some people have said that the beginning of the greedy Daffy, You Ought to Be in Pictures from Friz Freleng in 1940 is a perfect example of that. Because, in that cartoon, he has his moments where he's doing the song and dance, where he's doing his woohoo and all that other stuff. But pretty much the plot of the cartoon is Daffy wants to be the leading star of the studio and he's trying to get rid of Porky. This cartoon came out 11 years after that one, but You Ought to Be in Pictures, and another one that comes to my mind is another Jones cartoon, You Were Never Duckier, that again, it's just Daffy trying to do things for his own personal gain, as opposed to just being a complete screwball. Now that I'm thinking about this cartoon, it's just so impactful, just the things that it pioneered. The quote-unquote, the greedy Daffy, the fact that he always says, you're despicable. This is really the one that just sealed the deal for that interpretation of the character. And for better or for worse, I would say, yeah, it nailed that part of his personality down, because in some ways, especially from the 50s and onward, this became the definitive version of Daffy, and it became amplified for worse in the 60s when you had the Patty Freeling and Seven Arts cartoons that overdid his nastiness and his narcissism with Speedy Gonzales. It's rare now to see Daffy go back to more of his earlier days. I know the recent Looney Tunes cartoons had a little bit of a throwback to the wacky Daffy of the Clampett years, but there's a reason why this personality shift has stuck for so long, because in this cartoon and the other ones that Jones did in the 50s, this one, the other ones of the Hunters trilogy, Trip Along Daffy, Robin Hood Daffy, it's just that arrogance and that pompousness. It works so well. Obviously, you have a great straight man in Porky Pig and the other shorts, but in this one, it's interesting to see that, yeah, Bugs has always been the star and whatever and the protagonist of the cartoon, but in Jones's hands, he had to be shifted as well. So I think this is more of Bugs becoming a straight, kind of like Porky is a straight man character to Daffy's shenanigans, as opposed to his cartoons in the 40s where he was more proactive in the action.
With the different teams, they all had different ideas of what Bugs should be. So, of course, Chuck is doing his own thing with Bugs, and just like Frizz did his thing with Bugs. Usually with Yosemite Sam, and McKimson would do his thing with Bugs, and he would just be like a naive, childlike character going on these little mini adventures, like in the Ozarks, and I totally agree. Oh, and one bit of info I forgot to mention is that elephant, with that great line.
You do, and I'll give you such a pinch.
You do, and I'll give you such a pinch.
So that's based off of comedian Joe Besser, and he was actually referenced in another Looney Tunes short. Go check out Hollywood Canine Canteen. He's that short dog that interrupts everything in the middle of it. So that's basically.
Oh, I hate you.
But he was a comedian at the time. He was in quite a few short films, and he would even be one of the Three Stooges as the third stooge after Shemp passed away. And sadly, look, he was considered to be the worst of the third Stooges, but whatever, it's still part of history, so there you go. But wow, if my enthusiasm doesn't show from the beginning of this review, I mean, this is a masterpiece, there's no question here. The few things I did notice, and it has literally the same start as The Wild Hare. I thought that was an interesting touch right there, where it's the same, shh, be very, very quiet. I mean, that's why they don't hire me as a voice actor, right? Because I do try. But I know that Chuck respected Tex. So basically, yeah, I think he just wanted to do sort of his version of A Wild Hare in a way.
I think that makes a whole lot of sense. I mean, obviously Jones was one of Avery's animators back in the original Termite Terrace days, and I think this was a very, it's funny, I never thought of that from that perspective, that this was, an homage to his former boss / colleague. And of the other Jones cartoons that had Bugs and Elmer, I mean, there's not really other ones I could think of in the 40s that had Bugs and Elmer as a hunter per se, because I'm thinking of cartoons like Hair Tonic, Elmer's a Homeowner. Oh, it's actually interesting that now that I say that with Jones and Elmer and whatever, but the last time that, to my knowledge, that Elmer was a hunter in a Jones cartoon was 1943's To Duck or Not to Duck. And it's interesting that he already made a hunting cartoon with Elmer, but with Daffy as opposed to Bugs. And then he decided, hey, let me take Bugs, who I've already worked with a ton of times, and Elmer, and just merge Daffy with it. That whole story about, the person who had peanut butter, and then he accidentally put chocolate in it. It's like, oh, this works out really nice.
Yes, exactly. And, of course, we can't discount the contributions of Michael Maltese here. He's the credited writer, and he works just so darn well with Jones. He was definitely what some have called a Lennon-McCartney sort of relationship, just
very nice,
finishing each other's sentences and that sort of thing. And I dare say, and someone pointed this out when they were thinking, oh, Michael Maltese is the true star, he's the one that should be praised more than Chuck, which I think is ridiculous, by the way. But that's what someone said. But then someone pointed out, well, you could have taken the same script that Michael Maltese did, given it to another director, and it may have failed. Like, it may not have worked for whatever reason, you know. So just because you have a great script doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be executed perfectly. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, it's been said so many times in film history. Great director, terrible script. Great script, terrible director. It's not going to work. Fortunately, in this case, you had a great writer and a great director, and it's just their styles just melded so beautifully. I mean, you look at it. It's, who was the most consistent director from the mid to late 40s and onward? It was Chuck Jones. And a good chunk of that, not only he already had an amazing team of animators, Benny Washam, Ken Harris, and all these other guys, and layout artists and whatnot, but just he was already hitting that hot streak in the mid to late 40s. And then when he added Mike Maltese, it was like a done deal. There was nobody more consistent during that time period than Chuck Jones. It always does make me laugh because, I've seen pretty much all the early Jones cartoons. I would say from the Night Watchman up until, you could argue that the Draft Horse was the cartoon that, and the Dover Boys as well, that Jones really was starting to come into his own. But just going from a director that had beautifully animated cartoons, but they were all right, to being the most consistent and arguably the best director in that time period just says a lot. And honestly, still to this day, I would say the most influential Warner Brothers director ever, because 50, 60, 70 years later, we're still emulating the Jones style, not just the way that the characters are drawn, but just the way the cartoons are done. It's more of, when you think of the Avery and Clampett days, it's more of the zaniness and slapstick. But when you get to the era of Jones and Maltese, it was more of the puns and the wordplay and the dialogue, which are excellent, and there's been multiple times to try to emulate it, but you still just can't get it to the way that Chuck Jones and Mike Maltese did. They were just absolute geniuses at their craft.
Oh, exactly right. And I can't think of a single, I suppose, stinker, if you will, that this team produced. I mean, yeah, some are going to be better than others, let's not kid ourselves, but...
Yeah, but their lesser works was like,
Still,
you could say, like on a grade level, like a B, B minus.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
everything else, consistent A's and A pluses. And not to knock Chris Fearling and Bob McKimson were doing amazing work as well. And that's the thing. It's like, I'm thinking of, a sports team. It's like, yeah, you have, all three of these directors are Hall of Famers. Obviously, if you compare, I'm thinking of baseball, it's like you have a Hall of Famer, like there's a few that are on the upper echelons in history. Like you think of baseball, Babe Ruth and players like that. I'm going somewhere with this, but I don't know where I'm going. So
you're basically saying that you have three different teams, they're all A-listers, headed by A-lister coach, and they're all in the Hall of Fame for different reasons.
Yeah, I bet you were going to say this. I didn't see this cartoon nearly as much as others because I've always had a preference for the AAP package, the pre-48 stuff, mainly because I saw most of my cartoons on Nickelodeon and Turner Networks growing up. But if you had to think of a short list of Warner Brothers cartoons that have transcended not just the popularity of the shorts themselves. For example, some of my favorite cartoons, I love The Case of the Stuttering Pig. I love Rhapsody and Rivets, but these are not cartoons that people are constantly referencing or talking about. What are the ones that they're constantly referenced? What's Opera Doc, Duck Dodgers, and I would say this cartoon, or just the Hunters trilogy in general, are the most parodied and most well-known Warner Brothers shorts of them all.
Exactly. And I reckon if you go up to a whole bunch of maybe 100 random people on the street and ask them what's your favorite Looney Tunes cartoon, they would almost always, I guarantee you, they would almost always say, oh, the Duck Season, Rabbit Season 1. They may not know the name
exactly.
short, but they will say
if you say Rabbit Season or Duck Season, they know exactly what you're talking about. And the fact that scene and just that premise itself, it still works. I know, especially, in the past few years with the whole lovely, wonderful political landscape here in the United States, you see that meme being used for different candidates or sports teams, the Yankee season, Mets season, or whatever. It still works.
Exactly right. Hence why I used it for the intro. So hey, for Anthony's season, I hope you all enjoyed that ridiculous opening. I had to do it, But boy, looking at this short, I've seen it so many times. It is quote unquote overplayed. That's what people seem to say. That whenever something's overplayed, then all of a sudden they mix it up with quote unquote overrated. But no. I watched this short again. There is a reason why it's overplayed, and it is a legit masterpiece. For example, even some of the subtle things which most people miss. So, for example, when you see the first argument of Rabbit Season, Duck Season, for a brief moment, you'll see Bugs breaking the fourth wall and just doing the whole wink, wink, nudge, nudge thing with his eyebrows.
Yes,
you know?
I almost forgot about during that scene, and you just see Bugs just look right at the camera, and I'm like, that's the beauty of animation too. I mean, in live action, there's so many things that an actor could come up in improv or whatever, but that's just something I love about animation so much, is that these little Easter eggs, or, you know, the things that the characters do, that's not somebody improvising. That's someone, the director, the writer, the animator, deliberately throwing that in there. It was planned on purpose, because everything in animation, you have to plan it out, as opposed to, you know, live action where you can improvise a bunch of scenes and just throw them together in the editing bay and then go from there. Just that little wink, wink, nudge, nudge to the camera. I mean, Jones obviously was a master at that, just like saying so much with just so little body movement, and it works.
Exactly right. And of course, I just love how twice Bugs calls Daffy
Hey, laughing boy. Hey, laughing boy.
laughing boy. So I gotta say it like that, laughing boy.
Hey, laughing boy. Yeah.
It's only done twice and then it's never done again, but it just works perfectly for that scene. And I've known some grumpy individuals in my time. I feel like calling them
Hey, laughing boy.
at my job, so maybe I will start doing that. But I have to ask, isn't it weird that a vegetarian is a hunter? It's such an oxymoron that how a vegetarian can be a hunter. It's just I'm sorry, I'm a vegetarian.
I'm sorry, fellas, but I'm a vegetarian. I just hunt for the sport of it.
Don't let PETA find out.
Well, they'll review bomb my review, I guess. But
yeah.
It's so weird, and it just shows how the different units were doing their own thing. You know, clearly Elmer's eaten meat in the past. You know, you can see some dinner scenes with and all that stuff. What do we say to stuff like that, Manny?
Gee, I hope somebody got fired for that blunder.
Exactly, but no, we don't care. It's a funny joke in the context of the short. There's no continuity. It's just
It's a joke, son.
It's a joke, son. It's a gag, that is. for sure. It just stuck out. It's just funny because, you know, watching all these shorts in order, you know, you notice how they keep on changing different things, but they forget that back then, hang on, he did eat meat and now he's a vegetarian. But of course, the one big highlight in this one is, well, we keep on praising Mel Blanc for good reason, but Hank Azaria has pointed out in not one but two bonus features on the Looney Tunes Golden Collection about the genius of Mel Blanc in this one short.
Yeah, so Hank Azaria, if you're not familiar with him, mainly known for being in the 1998 Godzilla. No, I kid again. Yes, he's voice actor, most prominently in The Simpsons, you know, voice of Moe, the bartender, Chief Wiggum, tons of voices in the show. Like you said, one of the Golden Collections, he was talking about this particular scene, about just the brilliance of Mel Blanc. And speaking of Mel Blanc, he does do Elmer Fudd's yell in this cartoon when Daffy bites him in the leg.
Yow!
But in the scene where Bugs and Daffy start masquerading as each other, and you have Daffy as Bugs and Bugs as Daffy, and it's hard enough just to do one character, but you have Daffy Duck talking as Bugs Bunny, and then you have Bugs Bunny talking as Daffy Duck. And what Hank Azaria was trying to say is that just to prove and just to show how much of a master of voice acting Mel Blanc was, the fact that he was imitating his own character and not only maintaining, pretty much melding two different voices at the same time, because you hear the timbre of Daffy and Bugs' voice, but yet you hear the distinct vocal characteristics of it. So for example, Bugs Bunny's voice is a little lower than Daffy's, and I think, you know, mainly because Daffy sped up, but Bugs is talking in a lower voice because that's how he does it, but yet he still maintains Daffy's lisp.
Just a darn minute. Where do you get that duck season stuff?
It blows my mind because I'm like, he's doing two characters at once pretty much. And it's hard enough to do one. And yet it sounds so convincing. And if you get the chance to get the Golden Collection or whatever, I forgot what feature it is, but just find a clip of Hank Azaria explaining that scene. He does it a lot better than I do. It's a testament to just still to this day, Mel Blanc is arguably, if not the greatest voice actor of all time.
Totally agree. And you can probably find that clip on YouTube, I would say. If you type in Hank Azaria voice acting, I'm sure it'll pop up. But it's definitely a great observation. It's like peak Mel Blanc right there. It's just...
Yeah. What's up, Doc? Having any luck on those ducks? It's duck season, you know.
Just a darn minute. Where do you get that duck season stuff?
But I will point out too, in that scene, not just the voice acting, but also the animation acting, about how the characters are also imitating another character. So the animator is animating Daffy imitating Bugs. So the animator has to think, how would Daffy Duck imitate Bugs? So he's got the whole Bugs Bunny pose, and all that sort of stuff. And whereas you've got Bugs Bunny just waddling like just a darn minute, like
that's why I'm laughing, because that's exactly what I was thinking of. It's just that little just a darn minute, and just again the delivery and just that little waddle that Bugs throws in there as he's imitating. And of course, the greatest disguise in the world with a swimmer's cap and a fake duck bill. It's like, it's just so convincing.
Exactly.
Bugs, obviously he dresses up as Daffy, he dresses up as a female hunter. It's like, he's a master of disguise. Can't
exactly.
go wrong.
That's how I cosplay. I just put the fake duck bill and yeah. But anyway,
and a swimmer's cap. Don't forget.
Of course, and of course, gotta love the great ending in this short. What a great punchline Elmer season. I remember seeing it as a kid, and I'll just get an absolute kick out of that every single time. Just the expression on Elmer, which I poorly imitated in the beginning of this, the actual intro for this review. But wow. And then they both just be very, very quiet. We're hunting Elmers. Just brilliant.
Like you said, this is definitely one that it's soaked into our pop culture landscape. It's the beginning of so many different things that we associate with Warner Brothers cartoons. But I guess going back to your point, we were saying like how it took a while for Daffy to become this quote unquote greedy narcissist. But I just find it again so fascinating that Elmer and Bugs, if you really want to get technical, were around since 1938, because you had the quote unquote Elmer Fudd that is technically a separate character from Egghead, but he looks, a lot of people confuse the original Elmer with Egghead. And then you have Bugs's Bunny that first appeared in Porky's Hare Hunt, not Happy Rabbit, that's not the character's name. Bugs's Bunny, that started in 1938. And then Daffy the year before, 1937, with Porky's Duck Hunt. But the fact that these two characters spent, in Daffy's case, 14 years and Bugs 13 years, or if you want to say a wild hair, 11 years. And that they existed in two different spectrums of the Warner Brothers filmography, oeuvre, whatever you want to call it. It took that long, over 10, 11, 12, 13 years for them to finally cross paths. And for it to work so well, it blows my mind. Sylvester and Tweety, they were two separate characters for about 4 or 5 years. Wile E. Coyote and the Roadrunner coexisted at the same time. Daffy and Porky, were only separate for 2 years, and I've said it before, Porky and Daffy are my personal favorite Looney Tune duo, but I just can't believe it took that long for these two characters to come together and create some of the best cartoons ever made. But you were saying before the recording that it's good that it took them that long, because the Bugs of the early 40s and the Daffy of the late 30s, if you put those two interpretations of the characters in this cartoon, it would have not worked at all. It would have been a mess. And it's fortunate that, like they say, when you're cooking sauce, you just let it simmer a bit. It simmered for a decade, and look how great it turned out to be.
What's interesting as well is the music. There's actually not too much by way of music in this particular short, although what's used is of course effective.
It was kind of neat that Carl Stalling was doing, I guess, more original stuff, but you hear a lot of, obviously, A Hunting We Will Go. You hear a little bit of Angel in Disguise. I believe that's during the part where when Daffy is telling Bugs you're despicable and you're pickable, and that little improv from Mel Blanc, and he's taking off his disguise.
And you're very definitely despicable. How a person can get so despicable in one lifetime, it's beyond me. It isn't as though I haven't met a lot of people. Goodness knows it isn't that.
Shortening bread, obviously, anything food related, you'll hear that.
Butter, yum yum. Duck polonaise underclass.
And during the scene where Bugs is in disguise as a female hunter, you start hearing "Oh, You Beautiful Doll" in the background.
Oh, how simply dreadful. You poor little man. Did I hurt you with my naughty gun?
Only a few cues, and they're repeated a lot because I'm looking at the cue sheet. And yeah, all those cues were, especially A Hunting We Will Go, is repeated a lot in the cartoon, but short and sweet when it comes to the cue sheet, as opposed to, something like, I'm looking ahead, like Chow Hound and Leghorn Swoggle, which has more excerpts of popular music. And you know what? Actually, speaking of not only the music, but the soundtrack itself, I've been so used to listening to the wrong pitched version of this cartoon. And fortunately, thank you, Anthony, I was watching a version of the cartoon with the correct speed. It gave me a new appreciation for this cartoon, again, musically and sound effect wise, because that version that was remastered, I think, in the late 90s, and it's like lowered by a half step down or a whole step down, and it just sounds so funky and weird and off, and a similar problem with the Rabbit of Seville. But I'm like, thank goodness I could hear the original version again.
Yeah, well, that's what I've been using for this review. By the way, you actually reminded me of one bit I really enjoyed, and that was the vocal delivery of them reading out the recipes in their voices, you know?
Fillet of duck bordelaise, mater de butter, duck polonaise under glass,
Rabbit au gratin de gelatin under tooled leather.
barbecue duck meat with broiled duckbill Milanese.
Drool the rule. Or not only that scene, it's just the constant mispronunciations of the words. One of my favorite lines in the cartoon is just when they're passing the rifle back and forth to each other, but when Bugs just takes the rifle, he literally does a circle and he goes,
Wabbit.
Duck, fire!
kills me every time.
Oh, for sure. It's
Anyone for tennis?
Anyone for tennis?
Another great delivery.
Oh, but all right.
Man, this is such a good cartoon.
All right, so now you've heard me and Manny ramble on, and I mean ramble on, quite a bit on this particular review so far. So what you're going to hear are excerpts from recordings people have sent to me, because this is a Milestone cartoon. So I figured, hey, let's get as many people as I can to give their points of view on this short. Call this uncoordinated mayhem, okay? That's what we'll call this. So let's take a listen to what some of my past collaborators have to say about Rabbit Fire. And first up, of course, is my good friend, Devin Baxter.
Duck season.
Well, it's Devon season, actually, right now. Devon season.
Oh,
Yeah.
Anthony season?
Oh, Devon season.
Anthony season.
Devon season.
Manny season.
Dun, 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 dun.
Be very, very quiet. We're hunting Manny's.
That's right. That's why he's no longer here, because we hunted him good. Thanks for joining this wonderful celebration of a Milestone cartoon, and it's indeed a milestone, as you know. It seems to me like it's a bit of a risky thing, given that they hadn't done it at all before this one. I mean, what was it? 10 years for Bugs and 14 years or thereabouts for Daffy.
You know what's funny is that in the Looney Tunes and Merry Melodies comic books, Bugs and Porky are paired all the time. But on screen, you couldn't really do that because Bugs and Porky are what are considered cool characters. You know, not like, cool, man. No, they're like, their temperament. You know, Bugs is a cool character, and Porky is also of that same kind of temperament. You know, except in Jones's 40s and 50s cartoons, he's kind of like a fussy bachelor. It just wouldn't make a good fit. But in the comic books, they're kind of portrayed as like school children because they were for a younger audience. And of course, you might have already covered this, but in the past, at the peak of Bugs' career, Daffy considers Bugs Bunny a hero in Tashland's Porky Pig's Feet and calls Bugs to get Porky and Daffy out of the hotel.
Yes.
So, in retrospect, that's kind of interesting. In that early stage, a Daffy idolizes Bugs. He recounts a cartoon where Bugs takes the gun from a hunter and shoots him dead. What kind of Bugs cartoon was Daffy watching? I always wondered that. Regardless, Mike Barrier said in his Hollywood Cartoons book that putting Daffy and Bugs together was kind of like circus aerialists performing without a net, which is a very good point. And he also says that Daffy is portrayed as some kind of villain in the role, where he tries to save his own skin so that Bugs gets shot instead of him, you know?
Yes.
In the beginning, you have echoes of A Wild Hare, where Elmer says his iconic line,
"Be very, very quiet."
And you see what looks like Bugs Bunny's feet tiptoeing, but it turns out to be Daffy adorning Rabbit's feet so that Bugs gets shot. You know, right from the bat, Daffy is an out-and-out villain. And then as you go through the cartoon, Bugs is in more control of the situation than Daffy is, and he hates it. That's the key to the Bugs and Daffy dynamic, and that's how Jones and Maltese made it work. I feel like we need to talk about Mike Maltese as the writer of this cartoon, since this cartoon bases itself around wordplay. Because of the shrinking budgets during the late 40s and early 50s, I think it shrank every so often, probably year after year. In this cartoon, particularly, there's a lot of held poses to get through the characters' emotions and everything, instead of a Clampett cartoon where everything is bombastic and energetic and my God. So Maltese and Jones relied on wordplay more than anything. And that kind of has its roots in early sound comedy and vaudeville. I just feel like Maltese was really one of the key ingredients of Jones's cartoons during that peak period between, let's say, 43 to 58 releases after Maltese goes to Hanna-Barbera and he's not writing for Jones anymore. Going into the wordplay of Maltese's writing, Daffy says to Bugs, "That, sir, is an unmitigated fabrication," right there. These weird malapropisms. Then you have the recipes that Bugs and Daffy read to Elmer. Filet of duck bordelais, maitre d' butter. I looked up a little bit into what exactly Maltese was trying to achieve, because they sound delicious. But what exactly are they? So I looked up the key terms. Filet of duck bordelais, maitre d' butter. Bordelais, of course, is a French sauce made with dry red wine, bone marrow, butter, shallots, and sauce demi-glaze. Bugs says, duck polonaise under glass. That sounds delicious. There's two meanings to polonaise. One is music-related. Manny, I hope you're listening. And another is related to cuisine. For the cuisine, polonaise is melted butter, chopped boiled eggs, breadcrumbs, salt, lemon juice, and herbs such as thyme, basil, and parsley. Oh my god, I want to try duck polonaise right now. And musically, a polonaise, like Chopin, I think, wrote a polonaise, if I'm not mistaken. A dignified ceremonial dance that from the 17th to 19th century often opened court balls and other royal functions. I think Maltese might have been talking about the cuisine, but I had to reach out somewhere. Then there's rabbit au gratin de gelatin under tooled leather. That's where it starts to get really ludicrous. And of course you have potatoes au gratin. Au gratin is sprinkled with breadcrumbs, grated cheese, or both, and browned. Then it gets really delicious with barbecued duck meat with broiled duckbill Milanese. And Milanese, when you dredge thin slices of meat in flour, eggs, and seasoned breadcrumbs and frying them. Then Homer Simpson is gargling in his own drool right now. Oh.
Yes.
My favorite one is chicken fried rabbit with cottontail sauce braised in carrots.
I haven't even eaten lunch yet, and you're making me hungry with all these descriptions right now.
Sorry. Get Dave Gerstein on here. He loves to eat rabbit and duck. He makes rabbit stew willingly, and I love eating duck as well. I'm sorry for all the vegetarians out there that are against that whole thing, but duck is actually really delicious. I've never had rabbit myself. I asked Dave one time, rabbit and duck, there has to be something there. He said to me, as a kid, I always wondered what cartoon hunters found appealing with rabbit and duck as food sources, which is a good answer.
Maybe when I head to the States, you guys can cook up something for me.
Duck is kind of like dark meat of chicken. Yeah. That kind of taste. That's how I feel about it. So duck season, rabbit season, that whole iconic exchange. It's similar to a sequence in Duck Soup to Nuts where Daffy tries to convince Porky that he's a fish. And he goes, I don't believe you're a pig. Of course I'm a pig. I say you're an eagle. And it goes faster than that. Pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig. I'm an eagle and I'll prove it.
Eagle, pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig, pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig, eagle, pig. I'm an eagle and I'll prove it.
That's kind of a retread of that. But that has roots in vaudeville. Wordplay like that became prevalent in Depression-era film comedies like Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers. In one of Laurel and Hardy's iconic feature films, Sons of the Desert, one of their most iconic features, Oliver Hardy and his wife, played by Mae Bush, have an exchange where she tells him, you're not going to the convention, you're going to the mountains. And Oliver Hardy says, I want this known right now. I'm not going to the convention, I'm going to the mountains. And she says, that's just what I said, you're going to the convention, not that you're going to the mountains. Maltese absorbed comedy like a sponge. Growing up in the tenements on the east side of New York, he said in a lecture at Cal Arts in 1976 that he watched Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, Harold Lloyd, Harry Langdon, very, very big names today for silent comedy, particularly Chaplin and Keaton. And Harold Lloyd is great too. Now, when you get to the sound era, like I said, the Marx Brothers and Laurel and Hardy deliver wordplay of that same magnitude. And of course, later with Abbott and Costello, it's mostly wordplay. That's their whole routine, is basically just misunderstandings and such. It's all wordplay, especially on the radio, and it carries over in their movies, and it carries on in TV. And I bet that Maltese probably took inspiration from Abbott and Costello as well. Alright guys, I'm going to do an Animator breakdown. Might not be complete, and if I'm wrong, I do apologize, but here's what I know. You open up with Elmer sneaking along with his rifle. Elmer sneaking, then spotting the rabbit tracks, kind of like a wild hare. Daffy calling down to Bugs. Bugs emerging from his hole and telling Elmer that it's duck season, say the first minute or so of the picture. That's all animated by Ben Washam. Ben Washam, I feel, is the Chuck Jones style. If you look at 90s clip art of Elmer, Bugs, Daffy, they look similar to Benny Washam's animation in Rabbit Fire. Apparently, Ben Washam in the late 60s, in the 70s, at his home in Laurel Canyon, taught animation for free to students willing to learn. People like Tom Mitten were in those classes. Tom Cito, David Silverman, and Milton Gray was there too. I think Tim Walker also was a student of Washam's animation classes. That was his way of giving back to animation, the business. Not only that, to add more generosity, Washam actually took his students' pencil drawings, shot them at Jay Ward's studio where he regularly worked, and brought them back to be criticized. What's even better, this year they started giving honorable awards to animation instructors and teachers, and Ben Washam is one of them. So the more I hear about Benny Washam, the more I admire him as a person. Dave Silverman and I talked about Benny Washam quite a bit. I think David knew Ben Washam pretty well too. And I find it funny, somebody said when Bugs has the bullets graze his ears and he turns to the camera and there's smoke coming up, that it resembles a menorah. I have no idea if that's right, but that kind of makes sense. I don't know. If somebody could comment or let us know if I'm reading too much into that. I remember reading that a long time ago.
For sure.
The duck season, rabbit season argument and Daffy's head upside down is all animated by Lloyd Vaughn. So thank him for that iconic sequence.
Yes.
I'd love to know more about Lloyd Vaughn. I know Barrier or Gray interviewed him in the 70s and 80s. He's an underlooked animator, but unfortunately I don't know much about him. Elmer saying, no more bullets, and then Bugs repeating that is Ben Washam. Daffy coming back is also Ben Washam. Daffy grabbing Elmer's rifle is an animator I can ID. It's definitely not any style I've ever seen in a Jones cartoon, if you look frame by frame. Probably a newly promoted animator or an animator who never received credit. I looked through it frame by frame. It doesn't look like any of the four main animators at all. When Daffy shoots himself with the rifle, Elmer and Bugs saying, one bullet left, it's all Ken Harris. And that gross visual of the bullet in Daffy's scalp. I always loved that.
That's beautiful.
Mm-hmm. I think there's a layout drawing of that in Chuck-a-Muck, which is nice to see. Then we have Bugs and Daffy taking off their disguises while Daffy goes on his despicable rant. And Bugs grabbing the cookbook and reading recipe is all Phil Monroe. He does that long block of footage. Eric Goldberg said a long time ago in Thad Komorowski's old blog that Phil Monroe was great at conveying confusion. Like when Elmer is looking at Daffy disguised as Bugs and he doesn't know what the hell is going on, you know? There's another scene like that, Phil Monroe animated in Awful Orphan with Porky and Charlie Dog. Porky's about to carve into his lunch with a big knife, and Charlie goes, that knife, you wouldn't, you just couldn't. And Porky looks at the knife and back at Charlie, then back at the knife again, he's very confused about the sudden melodramatic shift in tone. I love it. After Daffy grabs his cookbook, Bugs and Daffy reading the recipes is animated by Lloyd Vaughn, so you can tell the difference between the two animators right then and there. You know, they split that scene between the two. Elmer revealing that he's a vegetarian, Daffy in the tennis garb. Anyone for tennis? Elmer shooting at Bugs and Daffy, chasing after them. Bugs talking to Elmer about an elephant gun. Then the Joe Besser elephant. That's all Ken Harris's stuff. Then Harris animates the last scenes of the cartoon, Daffy disguised as the hunting dog and Bugs dressed as a lady hunter, which, by the way, is one of my favorite Bugs in drag outfits. He looks very cute. That blonde wig. Their cover's blown. Bugs and Daffy ripping down the paper signs. It's Elmer season. Elmer runs away. Bugs and Daffy in hunting clothes. That's all Ken Harris, too. And that's the end of the picture.
Wow, Ken Harris did a lot in this one.
Oh, he did. The funny thing about Daffy in the tennis outfit, Corny Cole in an interview said that Ken Harris just wanted to bat out his 30 feet a week just to go play tennis. And that was one of his favorite activities besides playing around in cars and all that. He was a big car guy, apparently. I think he was a car salesman before going into animation, if I'm not mistaken.
Wow, I didn't know that at all.
I wanted to bring up production info from Keith Scott's record. According to Keith Scott's research, Mel Blanc recorded his dialogue track on September 3rd, 1949. Arthur Q. Bryan had a session that same date. Arthur Q. Bryan came back for another session on October 1st, 1949. Rabbit Fire was released May 19th, 1951, although an Illinois newspaper lists an earlier April 28th release date. Keep in mind, sometimes the release dates that are in film booking journals and things like that might differ from an earlier release date at a local theater. And I'm not talking about like a prestigious LA premiere or a New York premiere. You know, sometimes they're just small theaters that release the cartoon like much earlier than people think. It was reissued as a blue ribbon on April 8th, 1961, almost a decade after the cartoon came out. Another thing I wanted to add about the Bugs and Daffy dynamic, people might think, how was that in 1951? What did audiences think of that? And the answer is probably not as much as we think of it today. You have to consider the fact that theatrical cartoons, you might see at least, I don't know, 1 or 2 Bugs Bunny cartoons a year. And not only that, Dave Gerstein shared reviews of Rabbit Fire, and they didn't even mention Daffy by name. They mentioned him as the Screwy Duck or the Screwball Duck. The only people that would really care in 1951 were the comic book readers who would read the antics of Bugs or Daffy. I don't think they were really paired together in the comics back then. Again, Bugs and Porky were paired together a lot, but they behaved more like school children or like young children. Again, it's a kid's audience. So that must have been interesting for a young kid to see Bugs and Daffy together. But it wasn't until television that the short became iconic. And of course, Jones talked about it in later years because of the exposure on television. And now we regard it as one of the best because of Mike Maltese's wordplay and Chuck Jones's direction. I mean, it was a successful enough pairing that Jones and Maltese made 2 cartoons with Bugs and Daffy and Elmer together, Rabbit Seasoning and Duck Rabbit Duck. There, the wordplay goes into different routines. He doesn't have to shoot you now. You just have to shoot me now. And then Duck Rabbit Duck is just sign gags. Daffy is deemed as different animals, a dirty skunk, a mongoose. It's just different ways of Maltese playing around with that kind of wordplay. Like I said, I keep saying the word wordplay a lot.
Word.
You know. But you know what I mean. And another thing, too, in the 1951 release season, Porky isn't a solo character anymore. In Wearing of the Grin, that's Porky's last solo cartoon. From there on in, he's paired as a second banana to Daffy Duck in things like Drip Along Daffy and Deduce You Say and things like that. Or he's owner of Sylvester the Cat in a few other cartoons. And that just makes me think that maybe they didn't think Porky would be an interesting character anymore solo-wise. But the pairing of Porky and Daffy, like Daffy's a more sympathetic character in those. Porky's just a bystander. You build entire universes around his ego like Duck Dodgers and Deduce You Say and Drip Along Daffy. It's all based around his ego. And it's the same thing in the Bugs and Daffy pairing. He thinks he's in control of the situation of everything, but he's not. It's a great rebranding of the character, far away from the Screwball Duck that everybody favors now. It seems that the greedy Daffy was the way to make Daffy in the 80s and 90s. Now it's the Screwball Daffy of the Clampett era. Some people don't like the fact that Screwball Daffy turned into greedy Daffy, but I think it worked. It would get kind of tedious to have Screwball Daffy throughout the entire theatrical period of Warner's cartoons. Heck, Bugs was more active in the 40s and more laid back in the 50s. Characters evolve and change in some ways. Some for the better, some for the worse.
100% agree with you on that. So Devin will be back to give his actual rating at the end of this video, but for now, you're going to hear a few very brief thoughts from some of the previous collaborators on this channel, starting with my good friend, Huey Nelson.
Well, I hate to say it, I'm not really an avid Chuck Jones fan, but I'm just gonna say it. Rapid Fire is one of the greatest Chuck Jones cartoons ever. This is where I think everything for Daffy changes here, because he's more of a foil to Bugs here, and also he's no more of a screwball duck anymore. I mean, that's pretty much, I'm more of a fan of the screwball Daffy, but the self-serving Daffy is kind of my second favorite, because we actually did see it before in Fritz Freeling's You Ought to Be in Pictures, but he still had the screwball aspect to his character. Not to mention, this is the first cartoon of his forever catchphrase, "You're despicable." And not to mention, this is probably the most iconic, anytime when somebody thinks of Looney Tunes, this is probably like the most iconic short out there. And I like to point out that the scene where Bugs and Daffy engage in verbal warfare, where they say, duck season, rabbit season, duck season. I would like to point out that Daffy did it first in an earlier short from 1944, Duck Soup to Nuts. Also, what intrigued me about this is the voice acting by Mel Blanc, and it's kind of hard for a voice actor to kind of imitate both characters that they're playing. So I like the angle there where I was kind of amazed by that. And I remember seeing it, like when watching the documentary and the commentary on this, I think this showcases Mel Blanc's like impeccable acting. I remember watching this on Cartoon Network, or was it Cartoon Network? Oh, it was Boomerang. Yeah, Boomerang back in the days when I was a kid. So I do have some childhood attachment to this short. That's why I can, like, as much as I'm not really a fan of Chuck Jones, most of his stuff was on television back in the day. So I didn't really have access to a lot of the pre-1948 stuff, which is more of my favorite of the Looney Tunes catalog. But I remember laughing hysterically every time Daffy got hit with that gun. Anytime he got his beak blown off, form his beak would take after just getting hit with that shotgun, I remember just laughing hysterically at it. And the best part about it is this is only the beginning of the duck season and rabbit season trilogy, because there's at least 2 more left from it, and it just gets funnier and funnier. This is only just the start, and Chuck Jones did not disappoint with the first one.
Thank you, Huey. And now for my good friend, Eli Copperman. Take it away, Eli.
Hey everyone, Eli Copperman here, freelance animator and just overall animation enthusiast dork. I figure I might as well just share my thoughts on Rapid Fire. And honestly, I don't have a whole lot to say outside of what most people have said about it, especially with it being the first of the, I guess, consider the Hunter trilogy or whatever it's called of the Chuck Jones cartoons. Featured Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and Elmer Fudd. What I will say is, I think it's a really solid start. It might be my personal favorite of the trilogy. I mean, Rabbit Seasoning, I think, has funnier timing and gags in it, but Rapid Fire, having it establish stuff like Daffy's famous catchphrase of you're despicable, and even adding touches like Mel Blanc's versatile acting, Daffy imitating Bugs, and Bugs imitating Daffy. It's nearly impossible to not only get down a character and their mannerisms and their voice, but to get them down so well that they're imitating another character. I do think a lot of the humor in the short is funny in its own regard. My favorite moments in the cartoon are probably not what you'd think. I've known a lot of cynics in the past who just assume that, oh, this is all Looney Tunes is. It's just, oh, duck season, rabbit season, rabbit season, blah, 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 blah. Honestly, some of the funnier moments in it are just, I don't know, Bugs and Daffy just trying to one-up each other with those recipes in those cookbooks, and Elmer saying, sorry, fellas, I'm a vegetarian. Something about that just feels so human, and they're cartoon characters, you know? Having them say all that stuff just feels so relatable, and you almost feel as if you've been there before, and you just happen to be in somewhat of a gut measuring contest. But even beyond that, a lot of the animation from the likes of Ken Harris, Phil Monroe, and Ben Washam, I think they really served the cartoon. It's kind of unfortunate that Chuck Jones was more known for his strong layout poses, because it might be hard to distinguish who animated what based on those drawings. But considering how versatile these animators were in elevating his timing to really good heights. You can really tell how much they cared about Chuck's vision and brought them to life through Michael Maltese's elaborate comedic timing and wordplay, the gorgeous backgrounds and layout, and even the stuff from Carl Stalling. Just little details like Daffy setting up Bugs to get killed. That is funnier through Carl Stalling's music. Carl really knew how to elevate a cartoon spacing and humor through his little beats. Bum 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 ba-dum boom ba-dum ba-dum ba-dum. Just like it's so simple yet so elegant. But yeah, like Rapid Fire, it might be my favorite of the original Hunter trilogy, and I would always love it if people can look back at those cartoons and say, even if you're not a fan of the Daffy Duck that we got later on, this is a good example of his egotistical attitude being used in a rather comedic sense, and how he gets foiled and ends up kind of partnering up with Bugs just to kill off Elmer. It's little things like that that really made Chuck Jones the top of his game at that point, and I'll always cherish those great comedic memories for years on end.
Thank you, Eli. And speaking of Eli, our mutual friend Luke Perkins wants to say a few words. And I know, there's lots of the same footage being recycled, but hey, at least it's of a great cartoon, right?
Alright, we got to one of the most iconic pieces of Looney Tunes filmography ever. Not only that, it's also one of the most iconic pieces of film media ever, to the point where nearly everyone knows about it. Well, everyone including me as well, but you get the gist of it. Now, before I talk about the cartoon itself, I want to be able to talk about the nostalgia I have for this cartoon when I rewatched it recently. When I was a kid, I didn't really know much about the Looney Tunes outside of this one DVD I had called the Looney Tunes Spotlight Collection Volume 1, which didn't really have shorts from the Hunting trilogy in, but you know. So one day when I was a kid with my grandparents, we would usually go to the flea market at least around every Tuesday to Thursday if I was out of school at one point. Now, if I remember this correctly, this was at Hospice Flea Market in North Carolina, which when I would usually go there, there was this huge archive of old VHS tapes, merchandise, etc. One time when I was going to hospice with my grandparents as a kid, we were doing the usual, looking for tapes or CDs, etc. And then, one of those tapes was the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie. If a lot of you don't know, it was a package feature of a lot of the best stuff directed by Chuck Jones at his tenure at Warner Brothers. Out of curiosity and having no idea of these shorts, I decided to buy it anyway, with some of my own money. And I went back to my grandparents' house with the VHS with me, and I put it on, and I was just transfixed with everything that this compilation film had to offer. Like, it had What's Opera Dog, Bully for Bugs, and of course one of the shorts from the Hunting trilogy, Rapid Fire. And I remember watching it a lot as a kid and, you know, impersonating the classic Rabbit Season, Duck Season, Rabbit Season, Duck Season, you know, all that stuff. And it got to the point where I loved that bit so much that one time at an ice skating rink, I was just, you know, sort of quoting it sort of verbatim by myself. And all of a sudden, this group of girls that saw me doing it were like, "Oh my god, I love that cartoon!" And we started quoting the cartoon exactly verbatim entirely, and I was shocked that they also knew the cartoon as well. So either way, this cartoon made a big impact. Now, let's go over to present day, into right now. In preparation for this recording I was doing, I watched the cartoon, and I hadn't seen this cartoon in like almost a decade actually. And knowing how overexposed this cartoon was because I was watching the other cartoons, I was sort of kind of expecting the hunting season to be overrated, and I have to be honest, I hate that word, but I digress. So I was pretty worried that it wouldn't be as funny as I wish it would be. But then I finally rewatched it, and I'll be damned, this might be one of the funniest Looney Tunes shorts ever made. Not just by Chuck Jones, not just with Bugs Bunny, but one of the funniest Looney Tunes shorts ever made. People always keep talking about the rabbit season, duck season shtick, but personally, I think this cartoon has so much more to offer than just rabbit season, duck season, and a lot more to talk about. Like, first, because this cartoon is the first Bugs and Daffy duo cartoon, it kind of serves as a reintroduction to the characters itself, especially since Daffy has his brand new greedy persona. Now, Daffy has sort of become a bit of a schemer who wants the hunting game to start, and Bugs itself, as being reintroduced based on his personality from a wild hare, is the cool, confident rabbit, for that when Elmer tells Bugs straight to his face that he is a rabbit and he is gonna shoot him, what does Bugs do? Well, he gets out of his hole and starts munching a carrot peacefully. I'd also even say that it shows in the character animation as well. In one of the duck season, rabbit season bits, you know, the part where Daffy is trying to push the gun to Bugs and then Bugs is trying to push the gun to Daffy. When Daffy is pushing the gun to Bugs, he's a bit more quick and really impatient, hoping that Bugs will get shot, and then Bugs is sort of a cool, confident guy who's sort of just going along, knowing exactly what the punchline is gonna be. Their relationship with each other is interesting too. They're not bitter rivals or people who really hate each other. To me, for this short, I kind of interpret it as two kids playing a game, where they used to be popular kids so desperately wants to beat the other so that he could win. There's some delicious irony in that too, because with Bugs stealing Daffy's thunder, Daffy was the one who stole Porky's thunder. Now, personally, if you have to ask me, I think one of my favorite gags from this cartoon is the bit with the bullets. You know, well, what do you know? No more bullets. That kills me every time. I also noticed an interesting thing that I picked up when I rewatched this cartoon for the first time in years. Near the end of the cartoon, before the whole punchline with Elmer season, Daffy and Bugs are like putting on disguises to hunt against Elmer, and Daffy does a bit of a half-ass take on a dog disguise, and meanwhile Bugs is like resembling a pinup hunter that kind of reminds me of Betty Grable for a bit. If some of you don't know who I'm talking about, Betty Grable is this one pinup who was also a movie star for 20th Century Fox in the 1940s. And yeah, and it's interesting to think that while Bugs and Daffy are star characters in their own right individually, this is the cartoon that cemented Bugs and Daffy as an iconic duo in media, like with Tom and Jerry, or Bing Crosby and Bob Hope, or even Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell, like 2 years before Marilyn Monroe and Jane Russell. So yeah, that's all I pretty much have to say about this really iconic and really good cartoon.
Thank you, Luke. And yes, I consider it really, really funny, and heck, it's even ironic that this cartoon is being deemed to be quote-unquote overplayed, and what do? I overplay the footage. How about that? In any case, here is my good friend John, who's going to give a European take on this particular short. So take it away, John.
What has been said about this cartoon and hasn't been said before? We're in front of one of the best Looney Tunes shorts of all time, and for me, one of the best animated shorts ever made. It's simply a short that I really love. I know that the Hunting trilogy is a little bit overrated, but I don't care, because this cartoon is so good, and alongside things like Duck Amuck or some of the Roadrunner shorts, was a little bit of the reason why I got into filmmaking and animation. So first, how I was introduced to this cartoon. I had the Golden Collections, well, I still have them, but yeah, I have the Golden Collection as a kid, and I remember watching with my dad, and I loved it. Later, when I watched the Bugs Bunny Roadrunner movie, which I also owned in DVD, this cartoon was included in there, and yeah, I also enjoyed it. So cartoon I've seen so many times, I can literally almost quote it perfectly. Every time I rewatch this cartoon, it keeps getting even better for me. It's something that has been stuck on my mind. So first thing for all about this cartoon is Bugs and Daffy are together for not the first time, but for the entire short. They previously had shared the screen together on Porky Pig's Feet, but this is the first time that they are together sharing for the entire cartoon. Also, this cartoon still portrays, the crazy Daffy, but it's also when Jones' vision of Daffy finally begins to materialize, the greedy Daffy. For many, this was when the character had been finalized. Jones and his team seems to have been experimenting with Daffy's persona, like, making him more greedy, selfish, and this was seen on shorts like Daffy Dewey or You Were Never That Kid, but I think this cartoon was the one that finally gave Daffy that second part of his personality, the Jones portrayal, which I know many people aren't a fan of, but I like it as much as the wacky zany, so much that I even consider that both versions of Daffy are just the same guy, and this cartoon is a good example because it has, both of them. First, it begins with the crazy Daffy, since the short itself features Daffy even using his classic woohoo after, lending the rabbit tracks to Bugs' burrow. Another thing about this cartoon is just many of the lines. As I mentioned, it's very quotable. The rabbit season, duck season part is funny, and another highlight is every time that Daffy gets shot, the animators came up with some funny facial expressions for Daffy. One of my favorites is always when, Daffy gets, for example, his big shot and is spinning, or when his head goes up down, and then many of the punchlines thrown in this cartoon. For example, there's one when Elmer's about to shoot again Daffy, but there's no more bullet, and they're like, well, there are no more bullets. Daffy decides to check the gun. Punchline goes that there was one more bullet when Elmer tells that he hunts for sport, and Bugs is like, well, yeah. And Daffy comes out of nowhere with, a tennis racket, and he says, anyone for tennis? And the short ends hilariously with Bugs and Daffy disguised as Elmer, and Bugs says, be very, very quiet. We're hunting Elmers. I really love that ending. Possibly one of the funniest endings I find for Jones cartoons in a long, long time. But yeah, overall, this is such a milestone for the Looney Tunes because when I think about the Warner Brothers shorts, this is one of the first ones that comes in my mind. And not only for me, but for many people that I know. Another fun fact on this short is about its censorship, because there's a story that when the short aired in the 70s and early 80s on television in the US, all gun scenes were heavily censored, removed, so much that the pasting was almost impossible to watch the cartoon. Since many of the punchlines with this heavy censorship, you wouldn't have gotten many of the punchlines. But as a conclusion, I find this as an amazing cartoon. I love Rabbit Fire, and this is just the beginning of possibly one of the funniest cartoon trilogies of them all.
And thank you, John. So just a few more very small recordings before we get to our big guest at the end. So first up, it's Dave Germain. Take it away, Dave.
Rabbit Fire is a great cartoon for many, many, many reasons. But in this one, Daffy shines brighter than Bugs or Elmer does, in my opinion. Bugs and Elmer do great, of course, like they usually do, but in this one they're going through kind of the same motions that they always do. Well, this cartoon for Daffy is really kind of a watershed moment for him, because one consistent quality of Daffy, every incarnation of his, whether screwy, greedy, or whichever, is his audacity. In his first cartoon, he has the audacity to jump around on the lake like a loon while a pig is shooting at him. And in Yankee Doodle Daffy, he's got the audacity to perform for the talent agent while his own client, Sleepy Lagoop, just sits on the couch. It's Sleepy that should be performing, but Daffy just has to jump in and do the performance in his stead. 1 year prior, Daffy had the audacity to think that he could perform Errol Flynn-style drama. So now here in Rabbit Fire, Daffy has the audacity to think he can outsmart Bugs Bunny. He finds out the hard way that he has met his match, or not even his match. He has encountered a mountain he can never climb, I guess you could call it. That's Daffy's frustration right there.
And now my good friend and regular collaborator S.C. MacPeter is going to give his thoughts on the short as well.
Hello everyone. Well, Rabbit Fire is a great cartoon, no doubts about it. A historically significant one, particularly in the fact that it marks a turning point in Daffy Duck's popularity. Not many people realize that Daffy Duck doesn't appear in too many cartoons until the post-war period, and even then, in terms of merchandising, he wasn't one of the more prominently featured. That usually reflected towards Bugs, Porky, a bit of Elmer, and Tweety Pie, though Daffy was of course mixed in, but maybe not the most prominent. But that was all changing in the late 40s and early 50s, and this cartoon shows that putting the duck next to their most prominent character certainly boosted his popularity. I've actually seen reviews that were posted by David Gerstein of this cartoon, where they don't even refer to Daffy's name, suggesting that he really wasn't as popular as we may think he was until around the 50s. Of course, that was also helped by the fact that they had begun reissuing Daffy's earliest color shorts, which also meant that there was a further rotation in the theatrical units of Daffy Duck cartoons. And also the fact that, of course, there were more Daffy cartoons being made around this point. But aside from that, I think this cartoon's brilliant. I think compared to Rabbit Seasoning, which is mostly a rehash, I think it's a much stronger cartoon. It has a very, very effective score by Scully that highlights the emotions, particularly on Daffy Duck, extremely well. I think that it has great pacing. It never feels too tiring. They never stick too close to one particular gag. They keep switching how to do the whole rabbit season, duck season debate. And then it ends with the very odd Elmer season gag, which I think is really funny because it highlights a bit of screwball nature in Elmer, which we don't usually see. It was a very bold cartoon in some ways, as it reflects more of verbal wit than anything really slapstick, though there is plenty of slapstick gag to be found, and surrealism, including the elephant hunting gun gag, which only further highlights the pacing because that whole gag comes by so quickly, but yet you're still laughing, and you don't even feel like you missed anything, despite the fast pace. This is a great cartoon, and what more can I say that other people here aren't saying? I hope you enjoyed my thoughts at least on sparking Daffy Duck's popularity around this point. Overall, I don't see a reason to dislike this cartoon or any of the hunting season ones. They are brilliant cartoons.
So next up we have my good friend Jonathan from This Means Podcast, and if you haven't subscribed to his podcast, definitely do so. It's fantastic stuff, covering all sorts of things that are, well, loony. So take it away, Jonathan.
Rabbit season, duck season, Elmer season. This is just one of those seminal cartoons, Rabbit Fire. This was the start of the Hunter trilogy that Chuck Jones concocted with his team, and just everything here is awesome. It's so funny. It holds up. You have a great Bugs and Drag moment. You have this really great moment where Bugs and Daffy are hiding in the hole, and Bugs says, "Go check and see if he's still there." And Daffy peeks his head out, and he gets his the bullet kind of transforms his beak into this weird looking longer thing, and then he comes back into Bugs and goes, "Still lurking about." I love that moment. It's so funny. And there's also, this is used as the starting point, if you will, for Looney Tunes Back in Action. Joe Dante, who was friends with Chuck Jones while he was alive, they kind of reintegrated the intro for that movie around this short. And I just think it's seminal when you're talking about cartoons, the legacy of Looney Tunes, obviously. And, you're doing a wonderful job over there, and I'm so grateful to be a part of, this conversation. But, this wonderful short is near and dear to my heart. It was one of the first that Warner Brothers restored once they were in the process of, going through their catalog and, what should we, put out there for fans. This was at the top of the list for good reason. It is, fantastic. It's comedic. It is a wonderful pairing between Bugs and Elmer and Daffy. I think back in those days, whenever you're sitting down to watch a Bugs Bunny cartoon, you expect Elmer. You don't expect Daffy. And to have Daffy be a part of that, I think, was a really special thing. I can only imagine what the audiences back then were going through, but I'm sure they were dying of laughter over this short, as I was as a kid, as you were too, probably. So, yeah. And again, Anthony, great job with all the reviews. I expect to see great things come from this one, as well as the rest of the Hunter trilogy. So keep up the good work. And if you want to follow my work, I'm over at the podcast, This Means Podcast, on Apple and everywhere you find podcasts. Take care.
And thank you, Jonathan. And like I said, definitely give his podcast a follow. It is a fantastic podcast, and there'll be a link below to it. And before we get to our extra special guest, just one more brief recording by my good friend Blugenesi, who's a good friend of mine and a part-time editor on the channel.
As well as I could regurgitate everything anyone else on this video has said already, I'm not going to waste everybody's time. Everyone else has mentioned how much of a milestone cartoon this is. How it is the best pairing of Jones and Maltese, and how it could very well be Jones's most important short of all time. But everyone else on this video has already done that. And now I have 2. Ain't I a stinker? Oh, there's a season 5 episode of Married with Children with this cartoon's title as its name. I bet nobody else mentioned that. I'll have something more interesting to say for rabbit seasoning. Boo! Whoop!
Well, I'll definitely have you on for that one, that's for sure. And now, without further ado, my good friend Camden Spees and I had a chat with the one and only Linda Jones, daughter of Chuck Jones. So, I hope you enjoy the chat that we had regarding this cartoon, and she will also be part of Bear for Punishment, an upcoming review as well. Yeah, I guess we'll start with, Rabbit Fire. I mean, my kids and me, of course, absolutely love it. It's, a true masterpiece. Of course. Do you have any stories about the makeup of cartoon? Like, did your father tell you anything?
Not about those in 1951. In 1951, I was 13 years old. And I'm sure you understand that we did not have television.
Right.
We did not see the cartoons more than once, usually.
Mm-hmm.
In the time before 1951, and during the 40s, I went to see cartoons in the theater on Saturday afternoon. They had discovered that they could take the old prints that had made the rounds and splice them together and have a 2 or 3 or 4 hour show for children in the theaters. Of course, in those days, the cartoons were not made for nor seen by children, hardly ever, and they weren't intended for children.
Right.
When they discovered that they could pack a theater full of children on Saturday afternoon and get a dime from each one of them. They didn't have concessions in those days. They didn't have the food income or problem.
Yes.
So I saw a number of the cartoons that way during the 40s when I was, 7 to 11, around in that time. But we moved back to Hollywood when I was 12, and there was not a theater anywhere near where we lived. And so I didn't go to those Saturday afternoon shows during that time. And then I went to boarding school. I went to school in Arizona for high school. So I didn't see any cartoons then. But I have some stories. One of them is that generally during my early childhood, up until the time I was 12, my father, every so many weeks, 5 weeks or so, when the story was done and the recording had been done, and it has basically been turned over to the animators and everybody else, my father would tell me, instead of reading to me or reading with me before I went to bed, he would tell me the story of the latest cartoon. And he did all the voices, and he would, for instance, with a Roadrunner and Coyote, he would get up on the dresser and fall on the bed when the appropriate time came for the coyote to fall off the cliff. And so I did get a chance to experience the cartoons, even if I didn't see them. And I didn't see a lot of them, and especially when I was a teenager, for several reasons. One was I wasn't particularly interested in them.
Of course.
Most teenagers are pretty much self-absorbed.
Yeah, guilty.
Camden's an exception.
Yeah, I can agree with that.
Not that he's a teenager now, but
No.
he went through teenagers with us.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan of the trilogy of the Rabbit Fire and the other 2 Rabbit Season cartoons. I like the last one, but I like them all. I think each one of them has a wonderful pace. One of the things that a lot of people, I imagine Camden has figured this out, but I don't remember ever talking to him about it before. But one of the things that I discovered, which my father didn't tell me, but I did discover it by when I was producing the films myself, that in a general way, Chuck's style was to a length of a segment or a scene, and the next scene was half that long. And the next scene after that was a half of that. And the next scene after that was a half of that, which made the episodes progress in a way that just pulls you along into the timing of that is used in all three of those films pretty consistently. You know, one of the things that most of the people in animation say about my father was that his greatest talent was his timing. And and so I think that's a little insight into part of what makes it intriguing to watch.
You know, I've seen Rapid Fire so many times. You know, the Hunter trilogy, of course, so many times, and it never gets old. I absolutely adore it. And now that you pointed out about the length of time, you're saying the certain part would play a certain amount of time, then next week half, and then, you know, like I honestly didn't notice that. I'm
You're
gonna
not
have
supposed to.
Yeah, exactly. It's like in film. Good camera work, it means that you don't notice that there's a camera at all, and I
You
think that's the same
shouldn't,
thing.
you shouldn't really notice anything. You know, if the music is overpowering, or if the dialogue or any part of it is overpowering, the balance is not right. And I think most of both Friz Freeling's and Chuck's films certainly fall into that category of being almost perfectly balanced, almost all of them.
One of the things about the Hunting trilogy is that I think if you look at a list of the cartoons that the average person on the street would recognize, you know, Anthony and I would immediately say some of our favorites are also The Great Piggy Bank Robbery or Hide Having Hair or My Favorite Duck or whatever like that. But the first things people come to mind is, oh, like the rabbit seasoning one, or What's Opera Duck, or One Frog Evening. Ironically, usually, with a few exceptions of some of Friz's films and maybe some of Clampett's films, most of the things that immediately come to their mind is a Chuck Jones cartoon.
Yep.
Well, that's good to hear.
I do have to agree with that. I definitely do, because I asked my kids, you know, which one do you want to see, and they almost without fail gravitate towards those ones, and well, that's good. That means that they got great taste. I will say,
right?
They got great taste.
This is like one of those cartoons that would have been shown as the iconic, but would have been like one of the first that you really uses the different Daffy persona.
That's right.
But your dad obviously had good use of Daffy's wackiness before, and such like you know, My Favorite Duck, or
I love that one.
The one where Elmer and Daffy are boxing. I don't know which one that one is.
Rapid Fire changed Daffy. I think people have mentioned that one of the possible reasons for that was that they couldn't both be type A personalities. That Bugs had to be the type A, and Daffy had to be selfish and greedy and self-absorbed, and be a slightly type B personality in order for it to work. Otherwise it's just clashing. And they have, since the golden era, since the last 20 years or so, Daffy has regressed, in my opinion, to being more like Woody Woodpecker, and being very, very wacky and mean-spirited too. And I don't believe, you know, there's a fine line between the way Daffy was during the 50s and 60s or early 60s and mean-spirited, but I don't think he was ever mean-spirited, even though they shot each other and, you know, did all kinds of bad things. They never were hating each other. They were more just looking out for themselves, particularly Daffy looking out for himself. I think that's one of the things that I think the directors these days should avoid, is any of the characters being mean-spirited, except maybe Chowhound.
That's another one I got to do very shortly too. Actually, you just reminded me. Wow, now that one.
Yes.
It's
and that was 1951 as well, I believe.
Yep, and I'm going to be doing that soon as well.
Obviously, Daffy's personality would switch a little bit. Like, Frizz, obviously, and McKipskin a little bit later, both took notice of this, and Frizz did Showbiz Bugs, obviously, which I remember was mentioned in your dad's book as one of his favorite Frizz cartoons, because he gave and I think in a chapter in his book about Frizz, he gave this whole long list of his favorite Frizz Freeling cartoons.
He was an enormous admirer of Frizz, always.
But obviously there was a little bit. Sometimes they would switch, like in You Watch Me in Pictures, the one where they switched to live action.
Yeah,
that was a little bit Daffy, but he's more wacky-ish kind of.
He was.
Or like Clampett's Drafty Daffy, where he's just trying to get out of the draft.
Well, most of his films were more wacky, more along the lines of Tex Avery than Chuck and Frizz.
Because I did notice, because I mentioned to you before we recorded how I'm reviewing every single one, but also in order. And I've noticed it wasn't just some abrupt change for Daffy, just bang, he's now a little different. I did notice in a few Daffy shorts leading up that there was a slight change, but...
Yeah, that's the nature of these wonderful units that work together for so long, with the writers and the directors and the animators. We're all looking for ways to, I don't know if improve is the right word, but to look for more effective personality traits that wouldn't make them look entirely different. I mean, they each had their own personalities, so that's one of the things that I'm sorry about in some of the much more recent films, is that each of the characters has exactly the same personality. And I find that very disturbing. It's like one character in a whole bunch of costumes, and that's not the way those characters were developed.
Yeah, because I watched those myself, and I like some, but I noticed with some of them though, and I think you've hit the nail on the head there. They just felt too samey, and I think that, and it's just one of those things you watch, and you think, oh, there's something missing here. The animation's pretty decent, for modern day standards, but it just felt like, what's the missing ingredients? What's that X factor? Where is it?
Well, I don't think any of these characters are meant for features. I think that's one of the major mistakes Warner Brothers has made, in my opinion, is to try to make these characters work in a feature. They were not created for features, and I don't think they can sustain feature length. That's not who they are.
But comics, of course, comics is a different story, though. I think Camden can attest to that.
One of the things that I think with Daffy is that Daffy clearly was changing, because obviously in Tex Avery's cartoon, he was just a crazy duck running around, like on Daffy Duck in Hollywood, he's running around in the movie studio. But then when Clampett, Freeling, and Jones took over Daffy, by 1941, they started solidifying him and putting him different stories, whether it was in the Duck Tracy story or whether it was the Bugs versus Daffy versus Elmer boxing thing. So he's not just crazy, he's running around, but he's also got this whole motive towards him.
Right.
What would you say is your favorite gag? It doesn't have to be specifically in the first of the Hunting trilogy, but out of all the Hunting trilogy, what would you say is the one gag that is perhaps your favorite? I know it might be a bit tricky.
Pronoun trouble.
Would you like to shoot me now or wait till you get home?
Shoot him now. Shoot him now.
You keep out of this. He doesn't have to shoot you now.
Ha! That's it. Hold it right there.
Pronoun trouble.
Thank you.
Absolutely. That stands head and shoulders above every other gag and almost in every other cartoon.
Oh, it's brilliant. It's brilliant. Yes, pronoun trouble. That's exactly right. I think, with Rapid Fire, I've noticed when you're a kid, you notice all the funny different, beaks, exploding beak gags and all that. But then as an adult, revisiting them, and as you pointed out earlier, these were not meant to, these were actually more seen by adults. I gravitate now towards pronoun trouble. It's just incredible. Then that's what makes these so good, because of how they like kids can watch it and get one thing out of it, and adults can watch it and get something else out of it. Well, I hope you all enjoyed that, and I can't say I enjoyed editing a lot of that, but hey, you know, I wanted to make this big, and well, I only have myself to blame for that.
I mean, he did ask me to come on, so there's his first mistake right there.
Indeed. Well, actually, I'll tell you everyone a secret. I actually don't do the editing. I actually have a whole bunch of helper monkeys in the basement, and they all edit. You know, I have 1,000. I'll do my sister reference. 1,000 monkeys editing the review in 1,000 different ways, and hopefully someone will get it right. So that's the plan. I kid, of course. So I'm pretty much a one-man show for the vast majority of everything. But look, in terms of a rating, come on, guys. You know I'm going to give this 10 out of 10. I mean, if this isn't a 10, what is? So, yeah, 10 out of 10. What say you, Manny?
Of the 300 Trilogies cartoons, I think I prefer Rabbit Seasoning more personally, but it still doesn't stop the fact that this is a masterpiece. 10 out of 10. No doubt about it.
I would give it a 9.5 out of 10. It's really tough. I have to really rank the 10-star ones. Honestly, I can't rate them. It's that period of Chuck Jones where I find almost everything he spun turned to gold. So am I being too generous by giving them all 10 stars? Or 9 stars? Like 9 to 10 stars is usually what I would rank these things. I know that's not a great answer, but I swear, in the 1950s, Jones plus Maltese were an impenetrable force in animated short cartoons. You could not touch them. And I am not impugning Freeling or McKimson's work at all, but when you compare the three, it's unmistakably true to me. Like, I still enjoy Freeling. I still enjoy McKimson. It's like asking me who's my favorite Warner's director, or who do you like best? And it's like, oh man, I love them all, man. Like, even McCabe, he had a solid first season of Looney Tunes. Propaganda nature notwithstanding. Cashlin's my favorite anyway, but Chuck was great, McKimson was great, Frizz was great, Cashin was great, Clampett was great. McCabe had a great first season of Looney Tunes. Jack King, I don't know, man. No, we're not. Let me turn the car around. That's not what I wanted to say. Let's go back. No, reconsider it. Jack King didn't really cut the mustard there. Earl Duvall was subjectively an okay director. He made some of the most campiest, rubber-hosiest 30s Warner cartoons.
But to be fair, Jack King directed Buddy's Bearcats, and for that, I'm thankful. Yeah. That'll do it for this very long review. I appreciate everyone's patience, because this one took a little bit longer to get off the ground, but I'm so glad with how it all turned out. So, as always, guys, thank you so much for watching, and until next time, make sure that it's Anthony season when you're hunting Anthony's.
You're despicable.
Dun 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 dun. Yeah, I do that.
Be very, very quiet. We're hunting Elmer's. Ha ha ha!